Hi, this is Michelle again, and I wanted to do a review video with you because this is a long training and I just want to highlight some points that you might find on your exam. So let's get started. I will share my screen here. Okay, so there's some identification questions on this exam. So make sure that you're familiar with and can recognize the Azalea adult, moth, and caterpillar. The Azalea Lace bug and its damage, this stippling here. You'll want to be able to recognize that, as well as leaf miner and its damage. It makes these tunneling, this tumbling damage on the leaves. So that's caused by this little guy here, which is the larva, and here's the adult. But this is the kind of damage that it causes. To protect our pollinators, especially bees, you'll want to make sure that you spray at night. So from sundown to sun up is the best time to protect our pollinators. They're not out foraging at that time, so you're not likely to hit them with your pesticides. Florida betony is a weed that you may need to recall. Look at this really interesting root structure that it has. That makes it kind of unique. Spurges are very prevalent in our landscape. They creep and crawl. Florida Pusley, that's the one that we call Florida snow. Little white flower arrangement here at the terminal ends. It's more dense. The foliage and all is pretty dense on Pusley, tight together. There's another one we're going to talk about where it's more of a sprawling. Henbit, I think of these little feathers here, or these little petals like feathers, and they just remind me of little chickens. So that's how I remember Henbit. Then we have, this is the one that looks a little bit like Pusley because of the little white flowers at the terminal ends here, but it's more of a sprawling, less dense. Purslane, it's a more like a succulent plant, and you know, those kind of thick watery leaves sprawling again. Chamber bitters is pretty interesting because of these seed pods here on the underside. Makes it very interesting, and then it's got these leaflets with many little leaves on them. Crabgrass, you know, just know how to recognize crabgrass, one of those sprawling grasses. And then goosegrass. When goosegrass gets mature, it gets white down at the center and kind of flattens out. But when it's young, look at this photo here, when it's young, it doesn't look quite the same. So know how to recognize that. Purple nut sedge. Purple nut sedge has these little purple seed pods, which help you to know that it's purple nut sedge. If you look down at the root system, there's like a little nut, and actually hogs will dig this up. They really like the taste of it. So if you have a lot of hog damage, you often have a nut sedge problem, but purple nut sedge looks like this. So something else to recall, what is phytotoxicity? Phytotoxicity. That is that herbicide damage, or like a chemical burn that can happen as a result of drift, or if root systems erroneously uptake chemical, but it is that chemical damage, phytotoxicity. What about honeydew? What is honeydew? That's that poo that those piercing, sucking insects create. So it creates that sticky substance or excrement that falls down to the lower leaves. It's sticky, so dirt sticks to it, and then a mold can grow. So it looks like this, but the real reason that we have sooty mold is because of a piercing, sucking insect. And in order to fix the problem, you have to fix your insect problem first. What parts of plants do thrips usually damage? The flowers and the leaves. Think about the gardenias. You pick gardenias, and I, at my house, can't pick one that there's not a thrip running around. There's little elongated insects running around in the flowers, but they'll be on the leaves as well. What condition indicates a spider mite infestation? What kind of conditions do spider mites like? They like the undersides of the leaves. You're going to find where the leaves attach to the petiole, that webbing is what you're looking for. But you know, often on the underside you'll see them, and they like it hot and dry too. So as a pesticide applicator, if it's super hot in the middle of the summer, what are you going to do to try to avoid heat stroke? Well, you're going to adjust the number of hours that you're out there spraying. I'm not saying you can take time off of work, but you shouldn't be that many hours spraying in like a spray suit, especially you know, during the heat of the day. Try to reduce those hours. Why do we classify a chemical restricted use? What makes us say, okay, this one needs to be restricted? Well, it's because it can cause harm to people or to the environment. And that's why we say, okay, you need a higher license, a different type of license to apply this product. And you'll have to have a license to even purchase the product. So when we're looking at the active ingredients of plants, just understand that products with the same ingredient, active ingredient, may be labeled for separate uses. And a good example of this is glyphosate. Glyphosate is used on land. One product is Roundup that you might be familiar with, but it can also, glyphosate, be used in the water. You can't use Roundup in the water, though it is not labeled for aquatic use. But glyphosate is in a product called Rodeo, which is labeled for aquatic use. So it's the same active ingredient, but it's the other stuff, those inert ingredients, that sometimes make it where it can either be used on land or in the water, but not both. Remember that the Florida Department of Ag and Consumer Services is the governing body for your license. They're the ones who issue it, that you pay to renew and keep up with your CEUs. They also are the ones with the inspectors. Where should a notice of application be posted? Remember those little signs? Where do you have to post those? In a conspicuous location. So what's conspicuous? An easily seen location. So on our pesticide labels, you might find this B box. If so, that's an indication that this particular product is more toxic to our pollinators, so you need to be very careful to spray it after sunset and before sunrise to try to avoid hitting those pollinators. Also know that imidacloprid is one of those substances that's highly toxic to bees. So you have to be really careful with that product. If you get splashed with a pesticide during mixing and loading, what should you do? Well, what makes sense? You should remove your contaminated clothing and go wash yourself. You need to clean yourself up and then get your PPE on and then go take care of your spill, okay? But take care of yourself. Can you, as an LCLM, we won't worry about the L&O, but can you, as an LCLM applicator, operate a pesticide business? No, you cannot. How many unlicensed applicators can you supervise with this license? None. You may not supervise applicators. Recall the integrated pest management, the triangle that we talk about, where we talk about cultural practices, mechanical, biological, and chemical. So there's those different strategies that we talk about. Remember, cultural includes the plant bed. Preparing a plant bed properly is a cultural type practice, where pruning out, let's say you have a mealybug infestation just on one part of the plant, so you can prune that out. That would be mechanical. Biological would mean using those living organisms to help fight your problem. So the ladybugs or the beetle for the, the weevil for the Australian pine and the beetle for the air potato plant can be utilized. And then as kind of that last resort, we go to chemical. We always want to start with the softest chemicals first. reserving those harder or harsher chemicals for last, because we don't have as many of those to choose from, and we need to save those for when we really need them, and not be our go-to every time we see a bug. We grab the worst chemical in the toolbox and utilize that. So when we're looking at a bug in the life cycle, first of all, where would be the stage that it would be easiest to treat these insects? And that's usually in this kind of crawler stage here, where they still have legs and they're not as mobile. Once they get to this wing stage, they're harder to treat because they're all over the place, right? But this slide is actually talking about the simple metamorphosis. So remember, we have simple and complete. Simple is really only 3 stages. There's the egg, there's the nymph that looks very much like the adult with some minor changes, and then the adult. So simple, they kind of look the same, where complete, they look totally different. That's like from the caterpillar to the butterfly. 4 stages because you have a chrysalis in there. And so some examples are your aphids, leaf hoppers, lacebug scales, flies, mites. So we just talked about this. At which stage do you get the most effective control? And that would be here at this nymph stage where they're crawling around. So how do we help fight pesticide resistance? If we use the same chemical over and over and over again, we will build up the population that is resistant to that chemical. Then we have a problem, okay? So we want to rotate our chemicals, rotating the mode of action, the way that it kills, so that we can wipe out pest populations. So what's really going on when we have pest resistance? It's really because someone in the population, or a couple of someones in the population, has a resistance to the mode of action that you're using. And so when they resist that, then they stay alive and they can reproduce. And then they reproduce this whole population of insects or pests that are resistant to that mode of action. So remember that you need 2 things before there's a hazard. There's toxicity and exposure. You can have a non-toxic substance like water and have it poured all over you, exposure, right? No hazard because it's not toxic. Or you can have nuclear material, super, super toxic, but a full hazmat, nuclear suit on, so no exposure, therefore no hazard. But when you have a toxic material and you have exposure to that, then you have a hazard. So toxicity times exposure equals hazard, or plus exposure equals hazard. When we talk about spill control, we talk about the 3 C's: control, contain, and clean up. So remember to control the spill. That's when it's going glub, glub, glub. We upright the bottle. So we have controlled the spill. So, to help reduce some problems with storing chemicals, you don't want to store large amounts. You may get a great deal, but over time, the product's going to degrade and probably break down and not be as effective. But also, the container that it's in can degrade and break down and then cause a spill in your storage facility. So you want to make sure that you're buying the appropriate amount of chemical for what you're going to use, and not, buying in big bulk containers, because there's a possibility that you could have more spills over time because the containers themselves can break down. So the label is the law, remember, and if you have conflicting information about your PPE, your personal protective equipment, you always look at the label. It's going to list the minimum PPE that is required. You can always put on more. When you are filling a tank, you want to be sure to leave that air gap. If you drop that hose into the water, then turn off the hose, you're going to have that siphoning, which is going to contaminate your water source. So you want to make sure that you leave that air gap in there to not have that siphoning effect. Another thing that you could do is have a backflow prevention device, or anti-siphoning device, to help with that. Remember our friends, the nematodes, those little round worms? Well, remember that not all nematodes are parasitic and feed on plants. Some nematodes actually feed on other nematodes, and they're beneficial. They're good. So not all of them are bad guys. Remember that insects have 3 body parts and 6 legs, where our arachnids, or spiders or mites, have 2 body parts and 8 legs by definition. If you were to spill something in your eye, what would you do? Well, common sense says that you would go rinse with clean water, right? But if you get any kind of splashing, you know, spill in your eye, drift in your eye, you need to go rinse with clean water. The label sometimes will tell you for how long. Sometimes it'll tell you to seek emergency help immediately too, but common sense first thing, go rinse with water. As a pesticide handler, what is the most common exposure route for that pesticide? So if you're exposed, what's the most common way that you're exposed? Remember, there's ocular, inhalation, dermal, and dermal here is the one, because you have a lot more skin than you have, you know, eyes or nose, mouth. So you have a lot more exposure areas, and that increases that chance of exposure. So dermal is typically where you receive exposure as a pesticide handler. Remember that you don't transport pesticides in the cab or the passenger part of a vehicle. You'll want to keep those out of there, and that you always need to have your safety data sheet, or SDS label, and the label of the pesticide with you. Way back when we were talking about diseases, remember we talked about that the fungi or fungus makes up the biggest bulk of our diseases out there. There's more fungus than there are, you know, bacteria, viruses, phytoplasms, or other forms of pathogens. When we're treating weeds, that seedling state is the most effective place to treat. Remember, it hasn't built up the woody stems yet, or waxy coatings or hairy coatings on the leaf. It's still tender as a young little seedling. You could even hand pull it easily, but that seedling state is the most effective and easiest place to control weeds. Environmental hazards on the label, when you read that environmental hazard section, it typically is going to talk about water. It's typically going to give you instructions on whether or not you can use this product in water, near water, you know, at the high water mark. So typically the environmental hazards are referring to water bodies. So active ingredients often can be given away, the concentration and the title of the product, or the name of the product. So in these 2 cases, we've got Curanox 50 WP. The WP stands for wettable powder, and the 50 in this case means 50% active ingredient. So just by reading the name of this product, you'll know some more information about the product. Or we've got Smart Choice 5G. So that's 5% of active ingredient, and it would be a granule. Some of the common formulation types are the WP, wettable powder, or the WG, which is the water dispersed granule. Something else that we like are dry flowables. Dry flowables are like wettable powder, except for they come in like little pellets or granules instead of that dust from the wettable powder that when you mix in your water, it kind of dusts up a little bit. These dry flowables, or water dispersed granules, now are heavier, and so when you mix with water, they don't dust up. So they're also easier to measure out. Remember, the requirement on your sign that you have to post at time of application is 4 by 5 inches. Okay, so that does it for our review. Thank you for watching, and as always, good luck when you take your exam.